If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
The aircraft arrived on a gray June afternoon in 1944, rolled off the transport line at Rattlesden with the kind of quiet that usually meant trouble. To most men in the 447th Bomb Group, another replacement B-17G was just a number on a clipboard. One more flying fortress to plug the gaps left by spring losses over Germany. But to Corporal Robert Orlosky, crew chief and perfectionist by temperament, the moment the ground crew pushed the aircraft into his dispersal bay, he felt something was off. The nose panels were cinched unevenly. The left main tire had more wear than a factory-fresh bird should, and several cowling latches bore signs of rushed assembly. This was a bomber built fast, under pressure, a patchwork fortress meant to fight immediately. Orlosky climbed the ladder, ran his hand along the rough rivet line under the cockpit, and knew he wasn't inheriting a machine. He was inheriting a responsibility. If this aircraft was going to keep men alive, he would have to rebuild its reputation from the inside out. He spent the next 48 hours dissecting the aircraft with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He crawled through the bomb bay until his uniform was soaked with grease, checked each oxygen line by feel, and tapped every fuel feed connection for hairline fractures invisible to the eye. He found misaligned magneto leads, slack control cables, uneven carburetor mixtures, and a dozen small defects that weren't dangerous on their own, but together spelled disaster at 25,000 feet. The motors were within regulation, but not within his standards, so he recalibrated the throttle response, cleaned the plugs, and rebalanced the props until they hummed at idle like matched tuning forks. When pilots walked by and asked how the new ship was shaping up, he only said, "She'll fly when she's ready." By the time the aircraft was finally towed onto the hardstand at dawn on June 15th, Orlosky had already rewritten its personality. The B-17G that rolled out no longer felt like a rushed replacement. It felt handcrafted, tempered, something born twice. One of the gunners, watching the soft glow of sunrise on the polished aluminum, joked that the ship ran smoother than a milk wagon. The nickname stuck immediately, and Orlosky didn't argue. Deep inside, he already suspected that this bomber, this patched, imperfect, stubborn machine, might just become the most reliable fortress in the entire 8th Air Force. The first operational flights of Milk Wagon were anything but glorious. The crew was green, hastily assembled, and trying to synchronize themselves inside a bomber that still smelled of factory sealant and solvent. On their maiden run, an escort-supported strike toward Bremen, the fortress struggled to hold formation in the rough winter airflow over the North Sea. The pilot, Lieutenant Charles Red Halleprin, fought the controls like a man wrestling a stubborn mule. The instruments read well enough, but the plane drifted half a wing's width left whenever they climbed above 18,000 feet, and the tail vibrated during tight turns. The crew grumbled about turbulence, but Orlosky knew it was more. The airframe was still settling, the control surfaces still learning the forces of combat flight. Yet even with its quirks, Milk Wagon returned home with barely a scratch. Engines cool, fuel feeds steady. Halleprin taxied in, sweat running down his collar, and shouted through the open side window, "She's rough, but she wants to fly." Orlosky only nodded. He'd been watching the aircraft the whole approach, feeling the same truth. This B-17 hadn't shown what she really was yet. She was testing them. It was the second mission that changed everything. Target, Hamburg. Heavy flak expected, no friendly fighter escort until the inbound turn. It was a brutal test for any bomber, let alone a newcomer. Halfway to the coast, Milk Wagon's right inboard engine stuttered, coughed black smoke, then stabilized. Most pilots would have throttled back to baby at home. Halleprin didn't. He held formation, trusting Orlosky's movements and the crew's growing instincts. Over Hamburg, they descended into a furnace of bursting 88s. The sky turned black with smoke trails and shrapnel. Yet the aircraft flew with a steadiness that surprised even the bombardier. Something was happening, something subtle but undeniable. The more the crew pushed Milk Wagon, the more the bomber responded. The drift vanished, the rattling faded. Even the pilot's yoke felt firmer, as if the aircraft were aligning itself with the crew rather than the other way around. When they returned, Halpern gathered his men and said what everyone had sensed: "She flies better the harder we push her." That became the method: test the ship, let her show her limits, then trust her completely. From that day forward, Milk Wagon wasn't just a bomber, she was a partner. And the crew realized that survival in the 8th Air Force didn't belong to the cautious. It belonged to those who dared to push a machine until it revealed the truth about itself. The next weeks transformed Milk Wagon from an unproven newcomer into a quiet legend taking shape in the shadows of dispersal fields and briefing tents. Mission after mission, the crew found themselves doing something almost unheard of in the 8th Air Force, returning home without a single mechanical failure, flak tear, or structural complaint. It wasn't luck, at least not in the way the men understood luck. It was rhythm. On missions to Wilhelmshaven, Munster, and even the infamously defended industrial belts around the Ruhr, Milk Wagon flew like a machine that had finally aligned its heartbeat with the men inside it. The engines ran smooth, even in the thin, freezing air at 25,000 feet. The electrical systems hummed without flicker. The controls felt sharp and responsive. Halpern noticed it first. Formations that normally exhausted pilots, constant throttle adjustments, tiny corrections, turbulence rippling along the wings, seemed easier in Milk Wagon. Even the rookie gunners began to speak of the bomber in the same tone infantrymen used for a trusted foxhole. "She likes coming home," one of them joked. But beneath the humor was an emerging superstition. A B-17 that didn't complain, didn't groan, didn't bite back? That was something crews whispered about when they thought officers weren't listening. What made the streak astonishing was not the absence of battle, but the brutality of the skies they crossed. Over Cologne, a flak burst detonated close enough to rattle every rivet in the fuselage, yet the bomber absorbed the shock without so much as a puncture. During a long escort gap north of Essen, 6 Bf-109s dove toward the squadron's low element, slicing through defensive arcs. 2 fortresses took hits. One went down, trailing smoke. Milk Wagon's gunners opened fire in disciplined bursts, coordinating like veterans instead of men barely a dozen missions into their tour. The attackers peeled off, and Halpern held formation so steady that the lead ship radioed afterward to ask if he had swapped aircraft mid-flight. By the end of their 9th consecutive mission without a single hitch, the crew no longer joked about the bomber, they respected her. Orlosky maintained her like a surgeon guarding a miracle. Halpern flew her with a confidence bordering on reverence. To the outside world, the streak was invisible, just another B-17 returning on schedule. But inside the 390th, whispers began. Milk Wagon was charmed. And in a war where steel burned, wings tore, and lives vanished in seconds, anything that defied the odds, even for a little while, felt like something sacred.
December arrived like a clenched fist. The clean skies of autumn vanished behind walls of iron-gray cloud, and the 8th Air Force found itself battling 2 enemies: Hitler's last desperate offensive in the Ardennes, and the coldest winter Western Europe had seen in years. Milk Wagon felt both. Frost crawled along her aluminum skin every morning, Hydraulic fluid thickened until Orlosky warmed the lines with a blowtorch. Engines coughed as if struggling awake from a nightmare. Yet the bomber kept flying, sometimes through weather so bad that whole groups returned before reaching altitude. The Ardennes crisis forced HQ to push the B-17s harder than ever, striking rail yards, choke points, and fuel depots feeding the German advance. The crew of Milk Wagon flew missions stitched together by sleet, low visibility, and the constant fear of icing, an invisible killer of flying fortresses. Halperin's knuckles turned white on the yoke as the bomber shuddered through turbulence that felt like being punched by a giant. Still, the engines responded, the controls held firm, and the bomber clung to formation like a veteran refusing to be beaten by the weather. But everyone sensed it. Perfection cannot outfly winter forever. The breaking point came over the Ardennes itself, not from flak or fighters, but from the sky. Climbing through a dense layer of sub-zero cloud, ice began creeping across the wings, not in patches, but in thick, jagged sheets that transformed the bomber's shape. Airspeed bled away, the altimeter sagged, the vibration in the yoke grew erratic. Halperin signaled distress, but turning back risked losing the squadron entirely. The bomber's charmed reputation evaporated as Milk Wagon fought for every foot of altitude, her engines roaring at full power just to hold level flight. In the waist compartment, gunners scraped frost off their guns, breath turning the air into fog. Orlosky killed the de-icer pumps twice to prevent overload, then prayed as he brought them back online. For the first time in months, the crew felt the bomber slipping from their grasp. When they finally punched through the cloud layer into clean blue sky, they were behind formation and dangerously exposed. Below, the Battle of the Bulge churned in smoke and fire. Above, sunlight glinted off their ice-scarred wings. It was the moment Milk Wagon stopped being an invincible machine and became what she truly was. A remarkable bomber pushed to her physical limits, kept alive only by skill, desperation, and a crew unwilling to let her fall. By early 1945, Milk Wagon was no longer just a sturdy B-26. She had become a living legend within the 322nd Bomb Group. Crews rotated, faces changed, and missions evolved, but the aircraft's reputation only grew. Ground personnel treated her almost ritualistically, checking every bolt twice, then a third time just in case, convinced that her unbroken streak was tied as much to respect as to maintenance. New pilots, before their first sortie with the unit, were often led to the aircraft as if they were being introduced to an elder whose approval mattered. "You fly her clean, you bring her home," veterans would say. Superstition and professionalism blurred into one seamless culture, and Milk Wagon became the symbol of everything the group believed about precision, discipline, and survival. The day she completed her 100th mission was not marked by triumph so much as by stunned silence. In a war where aircraft burned out after 20 or 30 sorties, here was a bomber that had endured flak storms, icing, mechanical strain, and the sheer brutality of the European air war, and returned every time. Crews gathered around her after landing, touching the skin of the fuselage as if confirming she was real. The group photographer took images that would later become icons. Men smiling with exhaustion, hands blackened with oil, frost still clinging to the nose, and the number 100 chalked on to the bomb tally. Newspapers back in the States called her the immortal marauder, but inside the division, she represented something deeper. She embodied the idea that meticulous flying, relentless teamwork, and absolute trust could bend the odds of survival. And even as newer aircraft replaced older airframes, the story of Milk Wagon shaped a culture that outlasted the war itself. Proof that excellence once achieved could echo far beyond the machine that forged it.
By the spring of 1945, the European skies had transformed from the brutal battleground they once were into something that resembled a collapsing fortress, dangerous, but no longer impenetrable. As the German front shrank and Luftwaffe presence thinned, the role of the B-26 groups shifted from desperate survival to relentless pressure. Milk Wagon and her crews found themselves flying missions deeper into what remained of the Reich's infrastructure, marshalling yards in the Ruhr, last-ditch fuel depots, rail hubs feeding the front lines, and pockets of industrial machinery still operating despite months of relentless Allied bombing. These sorties were deceptive. They lacked the chaos of earlier campaigns, but the German flak batteries, fewer in number but manned by hardened veterans, were more concentrated and vicious than ever. Crews described the bursts as surgical, fired by gunners who knew the war was ending and were determined to make every shot count. Even so, Milk Wagon's reputation continued to grow, and each new pilot assigned to her carried an unspoken weight. They were flying a legend into the war's final chapter, and the expectation was to keep her legacy unbroken. The last missions over Germany tested every ounce of that legacy. Thick spring fog disrupted navigation, German smokescreens masked key targets, and the front lines moved so quickly that briefings were outdated within hours. Yet Milk Wagon continued to carve her path through the war's dying defenses, bringing bombs precisely onto targets that German logistics desperately needed to survive another day. On one of her final sorties, flak burst so close that fragments peppered the fuselage, ripping through the paint and puncturing panels that had somehow avoided damage since 1943. When she returned to base, ground crews ran their hands along the new scars, not with fear, but with a strange sense of inevitability. It was as if the war, in its final breaths, had tried one last time to break the unbreakable. But the aircraft landed, engines coughing, tires smoking, her crew exhausted yet intact. As Germany collapsed and the guns fell silent, Milk Wagon rolled back to her hardstand for what everyone knew might be the final time in combat. She had survived the worst skies in Europe, delivered her blows with precision, and outlasted the very war she had been built to fight.
When victory in Europe was finally declared, Milk Wagon and her crew felt the strange stillness that followed the end of a long, punishing rhythm. For more than 2 years, the aircraft had lived in a world of revving engines, flak bursts, and the thunder of bombs cutting through cloud cover. Now, instead of pre-dawn briefings and frantic maintenance checks, there were quiet mornings, uncertain orders, and a feeling of suspension, as if time itself was trying to remember how to move forward without the weight of war. The airfields across France slowly emptied as squadrons were reduced, consolidated, or prepared for shipment across the Atlantic. Some crews were discharged immediately, others were held in a limbo of paperwork and shifting plans. For the men who had flown Milk Wagon, the approaching return home came with mixed emotions: pride at having survived, guilt over those who didn't, and the awareness that they were leaving behind a machine that had become something more than metal. When the orders finally arrived, the crew packed their duffels, took one last walk around their aircraft and tried to memorize every rivet line, every patched panel, every scar that had carried them through the worst skies in Europe. For Milk Wagon, however, the end was far less ceremonial. She did not sail home on a carrier deck, nor did she receive the preservation crews believed she deserved. Instead, like thousands of combat aircraft suddenly deemed unnecessary in a world racing toward peace, she was ferried to a holding field in England, then reassigned to the vast disposal yards that were filling with B-17s, B-24s, P-47s, and every other machine that once defined the Allied war effort. Ground crews logged her arrival, gave her engines a final inspection, and chalked a faint serial on her nose, just another aircraft awaiting its fate. Some believed she might be sold to a foreign air force. Others hoped she would be preserved as a symbol of what the 322nd had accomplished. But no such orders came. At some point in the winter of 1946, her designation disappeared from the records, lost among thousands of surplus airframes slated for scrap. No photograph captured her final hours, and no logbook recorded the moment her aluminum skin met the cutter's torch. She simply vanished, absorbed into the anonymous mass of machines that had served their purpose too well to be remembered individually. For her crew, the legend lived on only in their stories, told years later at reunions to their children or to anyone willing to listen. Milk Wagon had given them life in the deadliest skies of Europe, and then, as quietly as she had risen to fame, she returned to dust.
In the decades that followed the war, the name of the man behind Milk Wagon's extraordinary reputation rarely appeared in books or official citations. He avoided interviews, skipped commemorative ceremonies, and quietly declined offers to speak at aviation clubs or military academies. To his neighbors, he was simply a mechanic with patient hands and an old back injury he never explained. Yet those who had flown beside him during the war understood exactly what he had done. He had bent chaos to his will. While other crews accepted that mechanical failure, weather, and enemy fire were the unavoidable dice rolls of the air war, he refused to surrender anything to chance. Every pre-flight inspection was a ritual, every repair a personal vow. He could hear misalignments that others swore weren't there, and feel engine trouble hours before instruments agreed. His work wasn't glamorous, but it was relentless, and it turned Milk Wagon into something nearly mythical. In a conflict defined by unpredictability, he created reliability where none should have existed. After the war, that discipline never left him. He kept his tools organized with near-military precision, woke before sunrise, and maintained a quiet code of perfection that only he fully understood. But time has a way of revealing what modest men try to hide. As archives were digitized and squadron histories rewritten, researchers searching for patterns in aircraft survival rates kept encountering the same anomaly: a single B-26 whose record defied statistical logic. Veterans who had served with the 322nd Bomb Group began sharing their memories online, stories of a man who, armed only with a toolbox and an unbreakable will, had kept a medium bomber flying through some of the worst conditions in the European theater. Soon, aviation historians were contacting surviving crew members, piecing together how one crew chief had created a maintenance culture so precise, so obsessive, that it lifted Milk Wagon from a standard combat aircraft into a phenomenon. Younger generations of mechanics and pilots began citing him in forums and training talks, calling him the man who beat chaos, not through heroics in the sky, but through mastery on the ground. He never sought recognition, and he never returned to the airfields
where his legend was born. Yet his legacy endures in every technician who refuses to cut corners, in every pilot who trusts their crew implicitly, and in every historian who searches for the quiet figures who shaped victory without ever stepping into the spotlight.